What's up guys, Aces up here, another video series. I think you're really going to enjoy this one if you have some No Limit Hold'em tournament experience and want to improve your game. I'll be reiterating some of my recent video concepts, including the importance of position, bet and raise sizing, going all in, especially when we become a short stack, chip accumulation and blind stealing, and going through the logical thought process when playing a hand, which means also thinking about the cards our opponent might hold, not just our own hand. And this leads me to one of the key topics this video series, which will be ranging our opponents. Furthermore, I'll talk about isolating, rebuy periods, and 3 and 4 betting. So stay zoned in as I explain all this with examples as I work my way through a $50 rebuy tournament. I played this tournament on Absolute Poker, but in the replayer I'm using the skin from my favorite site, PokerStars. So here we go. I'll be playing quite a few hands in the rebuy period where it's a little bit gambly potentially in some spots, but that's because I'll be trying to get a nice stack by the end of the rebuy period, and that should generally be your goal, is to play more hands, try and get yourself in a position to accumulate a lot of chips. If you are one of those players that only has a single bullet, that is only buys in once for the rebuys, it's okay I think to just buy in once and give yourself a bit of a shot and get some experience. But if you want to take an optimal strategy, you definitely want to have enough bullets to rebuy as many times as you need, and also give yourself, not to be under any pressure, but give yourself a chance to play freely and get some chips. And pocket pairs are great to do that. So when it folds it around to me, I raise here. You'll notice that I raise 3x, and often you'll see me raising 2x. The reason why I raise 3x here is just to build the pot a bit, because if I do happen to hit a 3, I want to make sure I get maximum value, and also I am in the small blind, so I will be out of position for the rest of the hand post flop. So I'd make it a little bit larger, but he just folds. And by the way, when I say maximum value there, what I mean is you can kind of think of it as a bit of an exponential increase. If you raise bigger pre-flop, then obviously there's going to be more money in the pot on the flop, and so you can bet a little bit bigger. And then of course that means there'll be more money in the pot on the turn. So that is something to think about. I've got pocket 2s here, so now I do just min, because there's more chance that we will be in position just against one of the blinds, which is the case. The big blind calls. Now what you want to get in the habit of doing, and something I mentioned in the intro, was ranging your opponents. You want to start to think about what sort of hands he can have. So what can he have in the big blind? Well, I mean, he can really have a lot of hands here, and definitely the king and the 10 are in the playing zone of the hands that the big blind often has. Hands like king jack, 10 jack, 9 10, king 8 suited. But he can also have a lot of ace x, 7 8 suited, and all sorts of queen 8 hands, because the big blind generally defends with a lot of hands. So I think a check here is fine, but this particular instance I continuation bet, but he calls the c bet. So I kind of feel that it's a bad board. We've only got the 2s, so I check back on the turn. And then on the river, the repeat 6, which also completes the hearts. He bets quite small, so I don't think there's any sense in calling there. Because if you're thinking about what he called the flop with, he could have a 10, a king, a flush draw, a straight draw, or a 6. And all of those hands improved. The flush got there, the 6 repeated. If he had a straight draw, like jack 9 or jack queen, now he has a jack. So there's really no hand that we can beat that would call with, that he would call with on the flop. And that's what I'm talking about when I say ranging your opponent. And it's very important to get in the habit right from the start of constantly thinking about what your opponent can have. Make sure you're doing it even in the smaller pots. You don't want to get to the stage where you're only in the zoning in on the big key pots, because you want to get as much experience hand reading, that is ranging your opponents, as you can. Here I would usually fold this hand, but because it's a rebuy period, I'd make a call with the queen 3 of hearts. But it's not a very good flop. The turn does give us bottom pair, but I don't feel it's strong enough to continue, so I just fold. Raise here with King Jack, and I'm from middle, and it's the two blinds, so I go ahead and c-bet. Now, the reason why I c-bet is because, as I said earlier, blinds generally defend quite wide. And this type of board with the high, low, low, that is the one high card, the queen, and the two low cards, the 2-3, when you're thinking about the types of hands that they can have, I mean, there's not really a lot of hands they can have that will love this board. I mean, sure, they could have, queen, jack, jack, queen, maybe queen 10, but there's just so many other hands they can have where when I bet they will just fold. Like ace 9 and 10 jack and all those sorts of hands. So now that I've said that, what should happen? They both call. So, it is a rebuy period, so you can expect them to be a little bit looser. And I think they're actually calling very wide here. So I think they'll have hands like, ace 4. They might even just call with a hand, similar to ours, so to try and hit something on the turn. The turn actually helps us because it gives us the straight draw. And it brings what you may have heard recently, me talking about a backdoor draw, in this case the backdoor clubs. But obviously there's less chance that they would have that because they've called the flop. And there was no flush draw on the flop. So I think this is a good spot to do what we call double barrel. So we fired the first shot on the flop. Now we follow that up with a double barrel on the turn, another bet. Now I feel like in this particular spot, because of the blinds and they're calling wide, this double barrel was going to work a high percentage of the time. When it doesn't, we can still win with an ace or a 9 on the river, or possibly a king or a jack might give us the best hand as well. As it is, they both folded, so we didn't have to worry about the river. So when you sense a little bit of weakness or you think your opponent might be wide, it's always a good time to put him under a bit of pressure, fire another bet. It's a bit later on and I've got ace 9 and I'm on the button. You can see the cutoff raises for 3x. Now it's obviously too strong to fold, and I actually could raise. Now if I did raise, it would be because I'm in position, puts pressure on him, and sometimes we could have the best hand because he's raising in late position. But what I decided to do in this particular spot this time was just a call. And so the blinds fold and we go to the flop heads up. Now, when you see this flop, you're probably thinking, I don't have much, I probably have to fold. If you're thinking that, that's good because you're already ranging your opponent without even knowing it. What you're really doing and what you're really telling yourself is that the chance of him having a 10 or a queen or king jack or some sort of part of that board is quite likely, since they're the types of hands that players typically raise with. And so I just folded that one. A couple of hands later with ace jack, open from the hijack, and they fold. And here with pocket fours, I open from second position. And you can see it's multi-way with 4 players. But I decided to bet. Now the reason for that is simply that in the instance my hand is the best hand, which it well could be if no one has a bigger pair or a 9. It's really not that bad a board for my hand. So, but if I check and everybody checks around and we get a free card, there's going to be so many bad turn cards. Any card above the 9 is going to be bad. And so that's why I decided to bet. But when this particular player calls on that flop, I decided to check back turn. And then when he bets on the river, I feel like he might have a hand like 7-9. He could have had a gut shot straight draw. That is 6-7 or 7-8. If that was the case, he either has a straight or a pair of 8s now. He could also, I guess, have been slow playing a 5. In any case, when you're ranging your opponent in this spot, you want to think about, what do we beat? Well, we don't really beat anything unless he called the flop with a hand like ace 4, ace 3 or ace 7 or something. But there's really not really much reason for him to call with such a bad hand on the flop. So nearly all the time he's going to have something better than our pocket fours. So I just folded. Bunch of hands later and we have ace jack in the big blind. The small blind. and the cutoff opens for 4x. What do you think we should do? Well, 4x is kind of an alarming raise size. Generally indicates a player that's less experienced at the game and therefore wants to protect his hand. And the fact that that hand is a bit of a monster. So for that reason, in this particular instance, I feel like Ace-Jack suited is too strong to fold. But I also get a feeling that he has a very big hand, ranging. Well, we flop top 2 pair, which is obviously a really nice flop for us. But there is a flush there. So when I check and he bets, I feel like our hand is strong enough to continue. If I just call, then any diamond on the turn is certainly going to be a bad card. Any king or queen, I guess, could also be a bad card if you had ace king or ace queen. In any case, I decide to raise commit virtually all in, and he does go along with us. So it seemed from the onset that he did have a big hand. And you'll also notice that on the flop, his bet was 300. That's almost full pot size. What we're doing here is we're putting all the information together. Started with a really big pre-flop raise. Most people min raise or 3x. He's gone for a 4x here. When you see a 4x or a 5x, unless you see the player doing it all the time with a lot of hands, when you see it, just be a little bit wary that that could mean a really big hand, as was the case here, especially when you combine that piece of information with the fact that he's bet almost full pot on the flop. So we were a little bit unlucky with top 2 pair though, but it was a tough spot. So rebuy, and back on the horse next hand. This is what I was talking about earlier. Seeing a few more flops than perhaps you usually would. And it's not a bad time to see a flop here because we're on the button, so we have position and we have a hand that likes some flops. King 3 suited. Now generally I'm not an advocate of just playing suited hands. Just keep in mind that this is purely because it is a rebuy period. You certainly don't want to get loose with a hand like King 3 suited. In this particular instance, our player checks. Now, it seems that when he checks on this particular flop, most of the time he's probably given up. I mean, if you think about the types of hands that would check, they're going to be hands like, King 9, Jack Queen, King Jack, Ace 8. Any hand that has a 10 or a pair, or an overpair like Jacks, would definitely bet. So I think it's fine here to go along and try to steal the pot. And that worked this time. So make sure you're attuned, and you're always ranging your opponent. In this case, he just virtually gave up the pot to us, and that happens quite frequently as long as you're looking for it. The big tamale from the hijack, and they all fold. Disappointing. Kings. Open for a min, and player 2 to my left calls, and the big blind also calls. So we go to the Jack 3-3 flop 3-handed. Obviously it's a great flop for our hand. When the big blind checks, I go ahead and bet. Now I want to get some value. I don't want to bet too small, but I don't want to scare everyone off and bet really big, like our opponent did before with this set of jacks. So I felt about 195 or around 200. Perhaps is a little bit small. I probably could have bet a little bit bigger. But do keep in mind all the time, I mean, what are they likely to have here? And that's really going to be a basis for how we should size our bet. Now, if they have a hand like, if they have a jack, they're definitely going to call. But if they have a smaller pair, like say 7s or 6s, they might also call 1 street as well. But not if I bet the full pot 390. Then they might fold pocket 6s. So by betting just around this amount, I felt like I could keep in those smaller pairs that we dominate because they only have 2 outs. So I felt like the bet was a little bit small, but the idea was right. As it is, it gets raised and then called. Now in this particular spot, the player who raised us, this player here, Zeus, 7289, I'm not worried about him having a 3. The reason is we've raised pretty early. So typically players won't call an early raise with a 3 in their hand. He's more likely to have a jack or a flush draw. I'm a little bit worried about the big blind having a 3, but I feel like if that's the case, it's really just a bit of bad luck. I think at this point it's fine to go all in. It could actually be the optimal play. This particular time, I decided to call because I wanted to make sure I kept in those worst jacks, like 10 jack, jack 9. If I go all in, especially Zeus, he might be able to fold those types of hands because he's seen pretty crazy action. He's seen a big re-raise and then a call, so he'd be pretty sure that someone's got a pair bigger than his jack, or at least a bigger kicker. When the 8 of hearts comes on the turn, now it's time just to move the stack in, and we see we're against the type of hand that we were hoping, just a jack. So we managed to fade an ace or a jack on the river and hold up to win a really nice pot, and we have a pretty nice stack now for the rebuy period. A couple of hands later, an ace king in the big blind. I decided to just call here against this player. Now, it's not a play that I would usually make. I really do it more so to trap. He's only raised in the cutoff, so he could be raising a lot of hands and just trying to steal blinds. If I re-raise, he could very easily just fold. So, because it is a rebuy period, I decided to take a little bit of a chance here, leave him in, and try and flop a nice hand. As it is, this flop doesn't give us a pair, but, as I said before, with the high-low-low type of board, it's really a board that doesn't necessarily hit our opponent. That is, doesn't necessarily help his hand either. So I feel like in this particular spot, ace-king is still going to be the best hand a lot of the time, and that's confirmed by the fact that he checks back on the flop. On the turn, I go ahead and bet. Now, it's important to keep in mind here that given what I've said, this isn't a bluff. I'm not bluffing here. I'm betting for value. That is, I'm hoping a worse hand will call. Well, what worse hands would call? When he checks back on the flop, there's usually 3 reasons for that. Now, the first one that happens less likely is that he's flopped a monster, and he doesn't want to lose action and bet in case we fold. That happens from time to time, but like I said, that's less likely. Now, the second reason is that he's just given up. He's just decided that on a queen 4-4 board with a hand that he has, such as like if it's like jack 8 suited, he's just going to give up. And that's a little bit less likely because most players these days don't really give up like that. They kind of fight for pots, especially when it's just a big blind defend. I've mentioned before how big blinds defend pretty wide. Chances are he knows that. So why doesn't he fire a c-bet? Well, that brings me to the third reason. The third reason why players will check back flops a lot of the time is because they have a hand that is pretty good, but they're scared that if they bet and get raised, they have to fold. So in this instance, what sort of hand would that be? Well, it could be a small pair, like 5s or 6s, but I think those hands would bet because there's only the one overcard on the flop, and he'd want to protect his hand. So I'd say it's more likely to be an ace-high hand, such as ace-jack, ace-10, an ace with a smaller kicker. So when I bet the turn, those aces might call, because we kind of look like we could be bluffing. He might think he has the best hand, and if he has a hand like ace-2 or ace-5, he also has a gut shot to a straight. So I'm betting for value on the turn, but he actually folds. Always keep in mind why you're betting, based on your opponent's range. When your opponent will fold better, it's a great time to bluff. When your opponent will call with worse, it's a great time to value bet. It's important to always be ranging your opponent so you know which bet to make. Here I go ahead and do what we call isolate. That is, I attempt to try to get the pot heads up. You're going to see a fair bit of that as we continue through the series. In this particular spot, it actually doesn't really work. When I try to isolate, I'm trying to get position on the player. Now generally, inexperienced players will limp in, so it's a great time with a hand like King 8, that's not too bad, suited, to try and isolate to a weaker player. Most of the time he's going to call, and then I have a chance to flop a decent hand with a King 8 suited, but if I don't, I'm going to continuation bet, and most of the time he's just going to fold. If he does call, then I have a chance to perhaps double barrel on the turn and make up my mind how to proceed in the hand and what will give me the best chance of winning, or if I should just give up. But in any case, the idea is to isolate to the weaker player in position and then outplay in post. Here I got called behind and then the initial limper re-raise, so it really didn't work this time at all. What did he have? Probably ace king, ace queen, maybe a pair of tens. Generally that's a sign of a weaker opponent when you see a limp raise like that. He's a little bit scared of flops. Free buy period is ended now, and so I've used my add-on, and we've got 11,000, which is a pretty reasonable stack, and we're chip leader for the table. Here with pocket fives, definitely not a time when you want to re-raise. True, they've limped in, but it's a great time to just pat the table, go to the flop four-way, and flop middle set. So I go ahead and check, and it's a very weak continuation bet by the initial limper. Gets called, so I want to go ahead and build the pot. Main reason why I want to build is because the pot right now is way too small to get all the money in. So ideally what I want to do is try and build the pot so that on the turn I can also make a bet, and then by the river I can get all the chips in. Now keep in mind that there's a lot of hands that he could have that aren't going to be strong enough to take that kind of action. But in any case, I have to hope that it's the case and go for maximum value. So I put in a fairly sizable raise, and look at that. Gets effectively jammed all in. So that's a great result for us. Till the turn comes. But there's always a river. House. Full house. So we ship a nice pot there, and have a good stack now. Up to almost 18,000. Pocket twos in the cutoff. Decide to call behind here. You'll notice that the player that raised has almost 7,000 in chips, so for the small fee of 255 we have the opportunity to try to flop a big hand and potentially win a big pot, or we're also in position, which will give us the opportunity to perhaps win the pot other ways by, for example, bluffing. Four-way, and it's a pretty nasty board, pretty connected, and so I decided to just go ahead and check, and it gets even worse with the ace. So it goes check, 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 and finally on the river there's a small bet, and I just folded. Queen king. It was limped, and I think I prefer the isolation that I spoke about earlier here. I can't recall if this was the player that actually did limp raise earlier, but it could have been. That might have stopped me from raising. In any case, king queen's quite a nice hand, and it also does, well, even though I said I prefer the raise, it does keep in some hands that he could have that are worse, like king jack, jack queen, king 10 suited, hands like that that he might limp with. And then if we both flop top pair, we'll have the better kicker and can win a big pot. And as it is, we do flop top pair, and it gets checked to us. So I go ahead and bet half pot, trying to get some value, but everyone just folded. A few hands later, pocket jacks from second, and I raise and the big blind defends. Ace high board. Sometimes I bet the ace high board. If you do bet it, it's important to be clear about why you're betting it and what your plan is if you get called or raised. In this particular spot, I felt that since he is the big blind, in a lot of instances when big blinds defend, they don't necessarily always go out of their way to try and win the hand post. And so I didn't feel that if I check on the ace 9-8 board, he would necessarily think that I'm weak and come out firing and trying to bluff me, trying to represent the ace. I felt that it's quite likely that he would just say, well, look, I've taken a chance with a marginal or a weakish hand in the big blind by calling a raise, and if I don't flop big, I'm just going to kind of give up. So that's one reason why you might bet the flop, is so that you can't get bluffed on the turn, because a lot of the time when you check back the flop, players will automatically bet into you on the turn. And so by betting the flop, you kind of avoid that situation. a lot of the time they'll fold, or if they do check raise, then you get the information that you were looking for straight away, and that is that they probably have the ace, or in some cases they will be trying to make a move on you. The other thing that betting on the flop does is it protects your hand. So if he has king queen, it protects our hand from him having the 6 outs, or if he has, you know, some sort of straight draw or something. But in this particular case, I decided to check back, and you know, if he fired the turn, I would be calling. But he just checked, and so he actually did have king queen. So on the river, I think I could definitely have bet. I'm pretty surprised I didn't bet that river, to be honest. I think it's a pretty clear value bet, because he could call with worse, because we've checked the flop, we've checked the turn, and now if we bet the river, he could have hit the 10. I guess he could have, you know, king 10, queen 10, something like that. But maybe he'll even call with a worse hand, like maybe he has pocket 7s and just decides that, you know, maybe they're good and calls. So I think that I missed a value bet there. So it's important when you're playing that you don't miss value bets, because over time they all add up, and that's one of the reasons why good players have a big advantage over weaker players, is their ability to value bet. And like I've been discussing a lot so far through the video, that all comes back to ranging and being able to put your opponents on a specific range of hands. And in this example here, I think it was pretty clear that he wouldn't have had a better hand than jacks. So based on the range that we've given him, which is a wide range, he's in the BB, you know, best case he has a weak pair, which, you know, which could sometimes call a value bet. So a little bit of a missed opportunity there. And the other thing is too, you can tailor your value bets to, you know, your opponent. So we could just bet very small there. There's 900 in the pot. We could have just bet, you know, like 200 or something like that, even just to try and get value out of a very weak pair. So you're always thinking about what your opponent has and how, in that case, you know, how much can we bet? How much will he call? And so you tailor your bet size around that. In this spot here, I call with ace-3. I think I usually raise here, and that is what we call a squeeze play. The squeeze play is when the pot's been raised, and between the raiser and you, there's a caller, and therefore, when you put in a re-raise, it effectively squeezes that initial raiser. He's kind of the meat in the sandwich, so to speak, because he's got another player behind him, as well as the fact that you've shown a lot of strength. Now, what usually would happen in that spot is, because he's in the hijack, which is a late position, and a position that players will commonly raise with very light, that is wide or weaker hands, in an attempt just to steal the blinds, he will usually fold. We're then left in this particular example with the cutoff, who has only called a raise. So it's pretty unlikely he has a super premium hand. You know, most of the time there he's going to raise with jacks up, ace king, ace queen will probably raise. So it seems like he probably has something like, you know, pocket 6s, ace 10, could have a hand like king jack. So by raising, you know, we force out a lot of those hands by, you know, representing a big hand, which is why a squeeze play here, a raise, is quite a good play. And that way we could accumulate a lot of chips. As you can see, there's already quite a bit in the pot, 1200. In this particular instance, I decided to just call with the ace-3 diamonds. We were in the big blind, so it was cheap to call, but as I've said previously, don't get carried away with defending your big blind too wide, because it's certainly the bane of beginning poker players, is getting themselves in trouble post-flop because they've called with hands they shouldn't have had. As you can see, the action continues, and by the river, it was the sort of hand that we suspected. So if we had have squeezed pre-flop, he may have folded 7s, but you know, if he did call with 7s, it could have got pretty ugly. So in the end, the line that we took, just calling pre and then folding on the flop, worked out well. It's a couple hands later, and I raise in the cutoff with ace-7 and the big blind defends. And so I go ahead and just c-bet with the top pair, and he folds. Open up again with 10 jacks suited from mid, and win those blinds and antes, so that's good. This one I'm on the button with ace 3, and this is what we call a 3-bet. And so generally players on the button will open pretty wide, lots of hands, because they're in the position post-flop if they get called, and they just really want to pick up the blinds and antes, and there's only 2 players behind left to act, so there's a good chance they'll be able to do that. That's a perfect time for something that I've discussed recently in the videos, re-stealing. Now this is what we call a 3-bet. Now the reason that term's come about is because limping, or effectively the big blind is like the first bet, and so nobody uses the term 2-bet. You don't hear that term, but what I've done here is kind of, well, it's a 2-bet. I've made the initial raise, and so he's made a 3-bet. And he's made it 3 times our raise, so it's quite a nice size, and you can see that it puts me under a lot of pressure, because he only has 5,000 behind. So if we call 1,200, you can imagine that the pot now is going to be close to 3,000. He only has 5,000 behind, so it's not going to be profitable to call, try and get lucky. It's just going to be a losing play, unless we think he's bluffing us. And then we could potentially move all in, put the pressure back on him, which I would sometimes do. If we did that, it would be a 4-bet. However, for this particular instance, I decided to just fold. Here I've got the 5-10 from mid, and I just go ahead and open up to try and win the blinds and antes. It's important to stay active, and they folded. Ace king from second, and the hijack jams all in. You see the big blind's 300, and he's got 6,000. So I mean, he's got a few chips. He wasn't super short or anything, but we have ace king suited, which is a powerful hand. And you can see it's a flip, 50-50. Well, he's a very slight favorite, but not after the flop. We flopped the nuts, and he does have outs though. And you can see how many outs does he have. Yeah, 7 outs on the flop, another 3 on the turn, so he has 10 outs. But we managed to hang on, and we, look at that, we are up to 23,000 now. So you can see we have quite a commanding stack. So that was a really key flip to win. And what you'll find is generally when you're playing, there'll be these key pots will come up from time to time, and that seems to be one of those key pots where it really propelled me to the final table. I raised there, and just thought I'll point out that I only raised a min, and earlier in the video I spoke about how you might want to raise a little bit larger from the small blind because you're out of position post flop if they call. The reason why I raised a little bit smaller here is because his stack size is not super deep. If it was deeper, I would raise probably 3x. But here I just decided to raise small because it already puts pressure on him. And then the c-bet, after that, if he does call, we go to the flop and I c-bet. That's going to put pressure on him as well. And we have the big stack. I felt like I didn't really need to 3x this particular time. So that's why I just minned. Pocket sixes, I raise and they all fold. Ace queen, I raise UTG. Player from mid calls and it folds around to the big blind who jams all in. It's kind of a similar spot to before, but it's different in one main way, and that is we've raised UTG and also got a caller from mid. So when he jams all in there, I mean, he always is going to have a great hand. But I felt like with ace queen suited, it was a little bit too strong. He wasn't super duper deep. The big blind is 300, and in some of the videos in the other videos, I'll really be breaking down stack size and giving you guys a real feel for exactly at what stack size, what sort of hands players are likely to have. And when you get really familiar with stack size, when you go through the video, or if you start to play more tournaments, you can pretty accurately start to get a really good feel for where you're likely to be at. And when I say where you're likely to be at, I mean how your hand is going to do against his range of hands. And in this particular spot here, with the big blind being 300 and him having around 6,500 in his stack, I feel like most of the time he's going to have pocket nines through to aces. You could have ace king, ace queen. I guess some players might do it with ace jack suited, I guess. But you know, not too much worse than that, because like I said, I'm UTG. Usually a position associated with strength, because you have 8 players behind you. Yeah, that's sort of what it felt like he might have, and it turns out he had tens. So you know, it's a flip. If he, you know, should happen to turn quads or if anything like that, I'm never making another video again. Okay, guys. Pretty depressing beat. I mean, ran into guy got quads on us. So unless I get a whole bunch of subscribers to make me feel better, so please go ahead and subscribe. And unless that happens, I'm afraid I'll be depressed, and there won't be any part 2 or part 3 of this 50 rebuy where I end up shipping it and winning a whole bunch of monies. So go ahead and click subscribe.